Across the stars, systems rebuilt their cities and buried their dead, not yet realizing that a deeper darkness was already coiling itself around the galaxy. That darkness had a name, though few dared to speak it: Darth Vader. He did not arrive with a fanfare. No coronation, no triumphant parade. He simply appeared, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. One day the galaxy spoke of the Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker, hero of the Clone Wars. The next, the name was gone, vanished from history, erased from memory, as though the man had never existed. Yet the truth was far stranger. The man in black armor was the same man who had once fought for the Republic's light. Or was he? Scholars of the Force have long debated the exact moment Anakin Skywalker ceased to exist. Some point to the instant he ignited his blade against Jedi younglings in the temple, others to the desperate battle against his former master on the burning shores of Mustafar, and some whisper that Anakin never truly died at all. Perhaps, they say, Vader was a mask, not just of durasteel and synth skin, but of identity. A prison built to contain the fragments of a man who could not bear the weight of his own choices. Theories speak of voices in the silence of his meditation chamber. Memories, not always welcome, slipping into his thoughts like unwelcome guests. The laughter of friends long gone. The touch of a hand he would never feel again. These were not the things a Sith Lord was meant to remember. But what if those memories were not weakness? What if they were the embers of a fire that could never be fully extinguished? In the quiet corridors of Imperial power, there were rumors that the Emperor's enforcer sometimes hesitated, that he sometimes stood in the aftermath of his own victories, unmoving, as if staring at ghosts. The stormtroopers never asked. They never looked into the blank lenses of his mask long enough to wonder. But there were whispers that somewhere inside that armored shell, Anakin Skywalker still fought to breathe. And yet, for all these theories, one truth remains unshaken. Darth Vader was not simply a man. He was a presence, a weight in the air, an unblinking eye that watched the galaxy from behind its mirrored mask. The first time he stepped onto a starship's bridge, the crew felt it, not with their eyes but with their bones. The atmosphere thickened. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the hum of the engines seemed quieter. Those who looked upon him felt a strange dissonance. The figure was tall, powerful, intimidating, yet there was something in his movements, slow and deliberate, that hinted at pain. Every step was a choice. Every turn of the head measured. And then there was the sound. The steady, mechanical breathing that filled the silence like a metronome counting down the moments until someone would die. Some officers claimed that breathing was the last thing they heard before the darkness closed in. Others swore it haunted their dreams long after they had left his presence. But where did this being truly come from? Was he simply born on Mustafar, forged in fire and hatred? Or had the transformation begun much earlier, in the quiet doubts of a Jedi Knight who felt the galaxy's trust slipping from his grasp? Perhaps the tragedy of Darth Vader is not just in what he became. Perhaps it is in how long he carried the shadow inside him, even before he wore the mask. The answers lie in the cracks between recorded history, in the unspoken moments, in the silence between one breath and the next. And those silences hold more than just absence. They hold the memory of a man who once dreamed of saving everyone. A man who reached for the light and fell, slowly, into endless night. Perhaps it is in how long he carried the shadow inside him, even before he wore the mask. Perhaps the tragedy of Darth Vader is not just in what he became. The answers lie in the cracks between recorded history, in the unspoken moments, in the silence between one breath and the next. And those silences hold more than just absence. A man who reached for the light and fell, slowly, into endless night. They hold the memory of a man who once dreamed of saving everyone. Beneath the armor, there was more than machinery. There was a mind, and that mind was a labyrinth. A labyrinth built not of stone but of memories. Corridors twisting back into the past, lined with doors that would never open again. Behind each door, a moment, a voice, a choice. The galaxy saw Darth Vader as unshakable, a tower of steel and will. But those who understand the Force know that even the strongest towers have cracks, and in those cracks, the light can try to enter. Some theorists believe Vader's greatest prison was not his armor, nor the Emperor's commands. It was his own mind. Trapped inside was the echo of Anakin Skywalker, a voice that could not be silenced entirely. Sometimes a whisper, sometimes a scream, a reminder of a man who had sworn to protect, to defend, to save, and now only destroyed. The psychological weight of such a transformation is difficult to imagine. Anakin had lived by the Jedi Code, or at least he tried to. That code had shaped his every decision for years. Now every breath he took as Vader was a betrayal of that life. In the stillness of his meditation chamber, with the hiss of the seal locking him away from the galaxy, there was nothing to distract him. No battle, no command, only the sound of his own breath and the weight of what he had become. Some suggest that these solitary moments were when Anakin's memories surfaced most vividly. The way light filtered through the leaves on Naboo, the taste of Tatooine's dust storms, the sound of Obi-Wan's voice, speaking not as an enemy, but as a friend. The Emperor encouraged none of this. To Sidious, such thoughts were weakness, and weakness was the path to failure. So when the echoes grew too loud, Vader buried them. Layer after layer, he covered them with obedience, anger, and the cold efficiency of a weapon. But theories persist that some of his actions, subtle, quiet, easily overlooked, were not entirely loyal to the Emperor's vision. To the Emperor's vision. Perhaps an officer spared here, the target allowed to escape there. No one dared to question why. Well, what if these moments were the voice of Anakin breaking through? To the galaxy, Vader was relentless. But to himself, he may have been fighting two wars, one against the Emperor's enemies, and one against the ghost in his own mind. Some psychologists in later generations would suggest that Vader experienced something akin to dissociation, that the persona of Darth Vader and the identity of Anakin Skywalker existed side by side, separated by an unbridgeable wall. One side, cold and calculating, the other, buried and powerless. But walls are never permanent. They crumble, brick by brick. And when they fall, the flood that follows can drown everything. Perhaps that is why Vader kept himself so constantly in motion, why he led assaults personally, why he was always hunting, always moving, always surrounded by the noise of war. Because in the silence, the wall would weaken, and the flood would come. What if the dreams he had, the visions that sometimes struck him in moments of exhaustion, were not given to him by the dark side at all? What if they were simply Anakin remembering? He might see her, Padme standing in a sunlit room, turning toward him with the same look she had when she first told him she loved him. And then, as quickly as she appeared, the vision would twist. The room would darken, her face would fade into shadow, and the breathing, that relentless breathing, would return. These theories paint a picture not of a man without feeling, but of a man drowning in it. The armor was his prison, but also his dam. It kept the tide from breaking him entirely, but it could not erase what lay beneath. And the question that lingers, the question that has no certain answer, is whether Vader ever truly wanted that tide to stop. For to let it come might mean to feel again, and to feel might mean to remember, and to remember might mean to regret. In the official records of the Empire, Darth Vader's movements were well documented. Publicly, he was the Emperor's enforcer, sent to lead fleets, crush uprisings, and maintain the order of the new regime. But the records were not complete. There were times, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, when Vader's location was unknown even to the highest-ranking Imperial officials. The Emperor knew, but he rarely shared. Those absences gave birth to whispers, whispers that grew into stories, stories that became theories. Some said Vader was sent on missions of absolute secrecy, tasks so delicate that even the Imperial Security Bureau could not be trusted. Others believed he was not serving the Emperor at all during these absences, but pursuing his own goals. One theory speaks of a distant world, far from the known hyperlanes, where an ancient temple stood. A temple carved into the face of a mountain, its spires blackened with age. Within, it is said, lay artifacts from a civilization older than the Sith themselves. And there, Vader was seen. Not by soldiers, not by agents, but by smugglers who claimed to have stumbled into orbit during a hyperspace miscalculation. They spoke of his ship descending through storms heavy with lightning, of a figure in black entering the temple and not emerging for hours. When he did return, they said, the air itself seemed different, charged, as though the planet had exhaled something it had been holding for centuries. Other tales place Vader in the ruins of Malachor, the scarred world where ancient Sith superweapons had turned armies to stone in an instant. There, beneath the dead soil, lie the remnants of knowledge the Jedi had long forbidden. Perhaps Vader sought these secrets not for the Emperor, but for himself. It is not difficult to believe. The Sith have always walked a path of ambition, master and apprentice, each waiting for the moment to take the other's place. Why should Vader be any different? One theory suggests that during the earliest years of the Empire, Vader began to compile his own library of knowledge. Not books, but holocrons. Not holocrons of the Jedi, but of the Sith, recovered from tombs, stolen from collectors, pulled from wreckage in forgotten systems. Where he kept them, no one can say. Perhaps in the deep vaults of his castle on Mustafar. Perhaps aboard a vessel known only to him. Wherever they were stored, they were his alone. Theories even suggest that the Emperor may have grown suspicious of these private missions. Sidious, after all, was no fool. He knew the nature of the Sith. He had risen to power through betrayal, and so he watched his apprentice carefully, allowing the leash to slacken just enough to see how far Vader would stray. Their accounts, scattered, fragmented, difficult to verify, of Vader confronting beings not aligned with the rebellion nor with the Empire. Beings who served neither side. Force users who walked paths older and stranger than Jedi or Sith. On one remote moon, they say, he crossed sabers with a guardian of the Ainti monks, defenders of a hyperspace philosophy, unlike any other. The duel lasted an entire day under the pale light of twin suns. When it ended, the guardian was gone, and Vader's ship departed in silence. Another theory places him in the unknown regions, where the stars themselves seem older. Some believe he encountered remnants of species thought extinct since the Old Republic. Perhaps even remnants of Sith cults who had survived in isolation for 1,000 years. To me, if such meetings occurred, they were never reported. Not in Imperial logs, not in intercepted transmissions. Only in fragments, half remembered by spacers who swore they saw the black silhouette on the surface of a distant, dying world. What would drive Vader to seek such places? Some say it was obedience, the Emperor's orders to recover knowledge for the Sith's dominance. Others believe it was defiance, an attempt to gather power enough to overthrow his master. And still others believe it was something quieter, that he searched for answers, not about power, but about himself. Perhaps in those hidden missions he sought the truth of what he had become, to learn whether he was more machine than man, to see if somewhere in the galaxy there was a way to undo the prison he wore. The answers, if he found them, died with him. The missions remain unconfirmed. the destinations uncharted, and the silence around them perhaps tells more than any official record could. There are stretches in Darth Vader's life where history falls silent. No battle records, no Holland broadcasts, only a gap like the missing pieces of an ancient mosaic. The official Imperial archives show him as ever-present, commanding fleets, enforcing the Emperor's will, hunting the last embers of the Jedi Order. But between the lines, there are months unaccounted for, years that yield only fragments of rumor and shadow. These are the unknown years. Whispers say that during these hidden intervals, Vader's path diverged from the Emperor's commands. Not entirely, but enough to draw him into missions outside the reach of the Senate, the fleet, and the war against the rebellion. Some accounts place him deep within the Mid-Rim, in worlds once ruled by the Separatists. There, forgotten droid foundries still breathed in silence, their mechanical hearts churning out machines that should have been decommissioned years earlier. Vader, it is said, walked among them like a specter, shutting down some, repurposing others, taking their cause for reasons unknown. On the industrial world of Foundry 9, miners told of a towering figure who appeared without warning. He said nothing. He simply descended into the mines alone. When he emerged, the ground trembled as though something massive had been awakened deep beneath the surface. No one dared follow. Other stories carry him farther, past the edge of the Imperial star charts, into the unknown regions, a place where even the Emperor's intelligence network thinned to nothing, where navigation was uncertain, and the stars themselves seemed to burn in stranger colors. Out there, legends speak of derelict fleets, drifting in silence. Ships older than the Clone Wars, older than the Republic. Ships that carried banners no one recognized. Vader, it is said, boarded these ghost vessels alone. Hours passed before he returned to his shuttle. Sometimes, lights flickered within the derelicts after he left, as if systems long dead were stirring to life once more. There are darker tales. On a nameless moon, a group of surveyors found strange markings burned into the stone of a cliffside. Symbols neither Aurebesh nor Sith script. Symbols older, etched with precision only the Force could guide. And there, in the wind-carved dust, they claimed to see a single, deep footprint. A print larger than any man's, shaped by armored boots like Vader's. Some suggest he sought beings who could not be found on any Imperial register. Survivors of ancient Force traditions. The Night Sisters of Dathomir, the last keepers of the Zepho tombs, the elusive priesthoods of Jeddah, who remembered the Force in ways untouched by Jedi or Sith doctrine. Did he go to destroy them, or to learn? In one theory, he is said to have returned to Naboo in secret, not as a conqueror, but as a shadow moving through its royal archives. What he sought there is unknown. Some whisper he was searching for a connection to a life long buried, a name he no longer dared speak. Others tell of his presence on Mustafar, beyond the castle walls. There are regions of that volcanic world even Vader's loyal stormtroopers feared to enter. Fields of black glass that sang in the wind. Caves where the stone glowed with a deep, unnatural red. It is said that there he walked unarmored, allowing the searing heat to burn against what remained of his skin. A ritual of pain and remembrance. The unknown years also stir theories of encounters with threats that never reached public knowledge. Vast creatures drifting through deep space, sensitive to the Force. Remnants of Sith spawn that had survived wars no one remembered. Even the suggestion of something older than the Sith, a will that moved between the stars. If Vader faced these things, he faced them alone. No records, no witnesses willing to speak beyond hushed retellings, and in the end, perhaps that is why the unknown years endure as they do. They are the places in his life untouched by the cold light of fact, shrouded instead in the warmer glow of mystery. Stories told in cantinas, in deep space refueling stations, in the long, silent hours between hyperspace jumps. Somewhere in those years there may be truth, But the truth may be stranger and darker than the galaxy is ready to accept. In the years after the rise of the Empire, the Jedi was said to be extinct. The Emperor declared it so. The Holonet repeated it. The galaxy believed it, but Vader knew better. He could feel them, scattered like faint embers across the darkness. Each one a remnant of the fire he thought he had extinguished. Some hid in the farthest reaches of the Outer Rim. Others disguised themselves in plain sight, blending into civilian lives. For Vader, the hunt was not simply an imperial duty. It was personal. Each Jedi he found was another piece of his former life to be destroyed. The search often began in whispers, reports of a mysterious figure deflecting blaster bolts with impossible precision, rumors of healings in refugee camps, injuries mended without medical tools, a farmer whose crops thrived in the middle of a drought. Imperial agents gathered these threads, but it was Vader who followed them to their ends. On the desert moon of Rhynar, he tracked one such thread, a former Jedi healer living as a midwife among a small settlement. She did not flee when his shuttle descended. Instead, she waited at the settlement's edge, her hands folded, her eyes calm. The duel lasted only moments. Her lightsaber never ignited. When it was over, the sands were silent again. In the deep forests of Heron-Kal, another survivor lived as a hermit. He had been a Jedi Knight during the Clone Wars. Now he carved statues of wood, each shaped like the comrades he had lost. Vader burned the statues before their final duel. The forest glowed red in the night, ash drifting into the canopy like black snow. Some Jedi fought to their last breath. Others surrendered themselves to the Force, letting it carry them beyond Vader's reach. But not all of these hunts were recorded in Imperial archives. Some were quieter. One account tells of Vader arriving on a nameless station, where a blind old man ran a modest tea stall. For hours, Vader simply stood there. They spoke no words. When Vader left, the stall remained. The next day, the old man was gone. There are darker suggestions that in some cases Vader did not kill the Jedi he found, that he took them somewhere, a place where the Emperor's shadow did not reach. And there they were broken, not for death but for transformation. It is in these whispers that theories arise about Vader's secret apprentices, not sanctioned by the Emperor, trained in darkness, molded in secret, shadows beneath the shadow. Whether these stories are truth or myth, the result was the same. With each hunt, the galaxy grew quieter. The Jedi flame dimmed. And in that silence, Vader walked alone. But even as the hunt slowed, he knew, somewhere beyond the reach of the Empire's grip, there were still Jedi, waiting, watching, and one day they would draw their lightsabers again. Others disguised themselves in plain sight, blending into civilian lives. For Vader, the hunt was not simply an Imperial duty. It was personal. Each Jedi he found was another piece of his former life to be destroyed. The search often began in whispers. Reports of a mysterious figure deflecting blaster bolts with impossible precision. Rumors of healings in refugee camps, injuries mended without medical tools. A farmer whose crops thrived in the middle of a drought. Imperial agents gathered these threads, but it was Vader who followed them to their ends. On the desert moon of Rhynar, he tracked one such thread. A former Jedi healer, living as a midwife among a small settlement. She did not flee when his shuttle descended. Instead, she waited at the settlement's edge, her hands folded, her eyes calm. The duel lasted only moments. Her lightsaber never ignited. When it was over, the sands were silent again. In the deep forests of Heron-Kal, another survivor lived as a hermit. He had been a Jedi Knight during the Clone Wars. Now, he carved statues of wood, each shaped like the comrades he had lost. Vader burned the statues before their final duel. The forest glowed red in the night, ash drifting into the canopy like black snow. Some Jedi fought to their last breath. Others surrendered themselves to the Force, letting it carry them beyond Vader's reach. But not all of these hunts were recorded in Imperial archives. Some were quieter. One account tells of Vader arriving on a nameless station where a blind old man ran a modest tea stall. For hours, Vader simply stood there. They spoke no words. When Vader left, the stall remained. The next day, the old man was gone. There are darker suggestions that in some cases Vader did not kill the Jedi he found, that he took them somewhere, a place where the Emperor's shadow did not reach. And there they were broken, not for death but for transformation. It is in these whispers that theories arise about Vader's secret apprentices, not sanctioned by the Emperor, trained in darkness, molded in secret. Shadows beneath the shadow. Whether these stories are truth or myth, the result was the same. With each hunt, the galaxy grew quieter. The Jedi flame dimmed. And in that silence, Vader walked alone. But even as the hunt slowed, he knew. Somewhere beyond the reach of the Empire's grip, there were still Jedi. Waiting. Watching. The unknown regions were not truly empty. They were a labyrinth. A tangled mass of stars, nebulae, and gravitational anomalies where maps failed and sensors lied. Few dared to enter. Fewer still returned. For most in the Empire, it was a place of mystery. For Vader, it was an obsession. Some said the Emperor had secrets hidden there. Others claimed the remnants of older empires lay scattered among its uncharted worlds. To Vader, it represented something different. Possibility. Possibility. The Empire had grown comfortable in its power. The fleet patrolled known space. The Senate rubber-stamped to the Emperor's decrees, and the people believed resistance was hopeless. But Vader had seen the galaxy's history. He knew power could be found in forgotten corners, and the unknown regions were full of corners. Imperial records show only a handful of sanctioned expeditions. Vader commanded several of them personally. Massive star destroyers drifting into uncharted space, their bridges lit only by the starlight beyond the viewport. On one such voyage, he arrived at a planet wrapped in perpetual storm. Lightning lashed across a black ocean. An ancient tower rose from the waters, built of stone older than the Republic itself. Inside, the air was thick with the dark side. The stones whispered when he passed. Legends tell that Vader found a chamber there, filled with relics, weapons that pulsed faintly as though alive. He took one. The tower collapsed behind him as he left. Another journey brought him to a frozen world where the air itself seemed to resist breath. Buried beneath the ice were the remains of a fleet from an age no historian could name. The ships were fused with the glacier, as if the ice had swallowed them in a single instant. Within one of them he found a holocron. Its language was not Sith, nor Jedi. It spoke of a power that did not bend to either side of the Force. There were rumors that some of these missions were not sanctioned by the Emperor, that Vader sought not to serve his master, but to surpass him. The unknown regions could hide many things: an army, a weapon, or the knowledge to end a master's reign. But the dangers were as great as the temptations. Star destroyers vanished without trace. Entire crews lost their minds, claiming to hear voices from the void. Even Vader was not untouched. On one expedition, his ship drifted for days without instruments or stars to guide them. The crew whispered that they were being watched. Vader did not deny it. Some believe these journeys were what led him to discover certain truths about the Emperor's future plans. Plans that involved threats far beyond the Rebel Alliance. Threats that would one day emerge from the very darkness he had wandered. Whether he returned with treasure or only knowledge, one fact remained. Each time he came back from the unknown regions, he was changed. Quieter, more deliberate, as though each journey carried him deeper, not into space but into himself. And always, the stars called to him again, letting enemies exhaust themselves before delivering a single decisive strike. The Force had always been with him. From the days when he was a slave boy on Tatooine, sensing danger before it arrived, to the moments when a podracer engine would respond to his slightest instinct, to the battlefield where his reflexes seemed supernatural. But the Force that flowed through Anakin Skywalker was not the same Force that sustained Darth Vader. The change was not only in the body, it was in the current itself. Before Mustafar, the Force felt to him like a boundless sea. He could move through it freely, dive deep, or rise to the surface at will. Every gesture, every thought brought a response. It was effortless, alive. After Mustafar, after the fire, after the armor, it was different. The sea was still there, but he was standing on the shore staring at it from a distance. Every time he reached for it, he had to push through the weight of metal and machinery. Breathing itself became a constant reminder of that barrier. His armor was life. It was also a cage. The synthetic limbs responded with precision, but lacked the subtlety of flesh. Through them, the Force did not flow as smoothly. The respirator that kept him alive also kept him aware of every breath, every heartbeat, mechanical, regulated, unnatural. The Jedi teachings had always emphasized peace. Sith teachings, passion. Vader had neither peace nor the full range of passion. Instead, his connection to the Force was filtered through constant pain. The pain became the rhythm of his existence, and pain was a path to the dark side. He learned to use it. The agony in his limbs, the burn in his lungs, the phantom memories of the lava's heat, all became fuel. It sharpened his will. It turned every act into a deliberate choice, every movement into a weapon. Where once he had relied on speed and agility, Vader adapted to patience. He could no longer dance across the battlefield as he once had. Now he became the immovable center, letting enemies exhaust themselves before delivering a single decisive strike. The Force around him reflected this change. It was heavier, slower in its movements, but deeper, like the pressure at the bottom of an ocean trench. Those who faced him described a presence unlike anything they had felt before. It was as though the air thickened. The light dimmed. Even the bravest warriors felt their resolve falter before a single blow was struck. And there were other changes. Vader discovered that his injuries, while limiting some abilities, heightened others. His senses extended in strange ways. Deprived of certain physical sensations, he became acutely aware of emotional currents in the Force. He could feel fear like heat radiating from an enemy. He could sense lies in the subtle tremors of the mind. This sensitivity allowed him to hunt, to interrogate, to manipulate. The Force became a scalpel instead of a blade. Though when needed, it could still be a blade. Meditation was different for him now. Before, it had been about quieting the mind, letting the Force wash over him. Now, it was about holding the pain in place, shaping it, controlling it. He would kneel in the dark, the hiss of his respirator, the only sound, and let the memories come. Every betrayal, every failure, every loss. Then he would let the anger grow until the darkness became complete. There were times when he reached for the Force in moments of extreme need and felt something else reach back. Not the Emperor, not any presence he could name, but something vast, old, and patient. Something that seemed to recognize him and approve. These moments were rare, but they lingered. Some theorists believe that the combination of his mechanical form and his willpower made Vader a unique conduit in the Force. Neither fully man nor machine, his existence blurred the lines between life and artifice. This may have allowed him to touch aspects of the Force that were hidden to others. The Emperor, they say, may have sensed this and feared it. If that is true, it would explain why Vader's training in the deeper Sith mysteries was limited, why certain holocrons were kept from him, why some rituals were never taught. But it also explains why Vader sought knowledge outside the Emperor's reach. Why he traveled to ancient worlds. Why he traveled to ancient worlds. Why he stood alone in the ruins of civilizations that had fallen long before the Republic rose. Because in the silence of those forgotten places, in the stillness between each mechanical breath, he felt it. The Force, not as the Jedi had described it, not as the Sith had twisted it, but as something greater. And he knew he had not yet reached the end of its depths. Letting enemies exhaust themselves before delivering a single decisive strike. Though when needed, it could still be a blade. Meditation was different for him now. Before, it had been about quieting the mind, letting the Force wash over him. Now, it was about holding the pain in place, shaping it, controlling it. He would kneel in the dark, the hiss of his respirator, the only sound, and let the memories come. Every betrayal, every failure, every loss. Then he would let the anger grow until the darkness became complete. There were times when he reached for the Force in moments of extreme need and felt something else reach back. Not the Emperor, not any presence he could name, but something vast, old, and patient. Something that seemed to recognize him and approve. These moments were rare, but they lingered. Some theorists believe that the combination of his mechanical form and his willpower made Vader a unique conduit in the Force. Neither fully man nor machine, his existence blurred the lines between life and artifice. This may have allowed him to touch aspects of the Force that were hidden to others. The Emperor, they say, may have sensed this and feared it. If that is true, it would explain why Vader's training in the deeper Sith mysteries was limited. Why certain holocrons were kept from him. Why some rituals were never taught. But it also explains why Vader sought knowledge outside the Emperor's reach. Why he traveled to ancient worlds. Why he stood alone in the ruins of civilizations that had fallen long before the Republic rose. Because in the silence of those forgotten places, in the stillness between each mechanical breath, he felt it. The Force, not as the Jedi had described it, not as the Sith had twisted it, but as something greater. And he knew he had not yet reached the end of its depths. There were places in the galaxy where no one could follow him. Places even the Emperor did not know existed. Places built not for war, but for silence. Vader did not speak of them. Not to officers, not to inquisitors, not even to his master. These sanctuaries were scattered across the stars, some on remote moons, some buried beneath dead cities, some hidden in the folds of nebulae where sensors faltered and signals died. Each sanctuary was different, shaped by the world it inhabited. One was a black fortress carved into the side of a cliff on Vedun, where the rains were acidic and the soil poisoned. Here, the storms never ended. The sky was a constant churn of clouds, lit from within by pale flashes of lightning. He would stand at the fortress's highest balcony, armor dripping with rain, feeling the corrosion against his plating, and let the fury of the world soak into him. The air was toxic to most life, but to him it was cleansing. Another sanctuary lay beneath the sands of Jakku. Few knew of the ancient catacombs there, older than the Republic itself. The tunnels were lined with walls that hummed faintly with the echoes of the dark side. Down here, far from the stars, Vader could hear the whisper of old battles, the ghosts of warriors who had fallen long before his birth. Sometimes in the deepest chambers he believed he could hear his own future speaking back to him. There was one sanctuary aboard a derelict medical frigate drifting in the void. The ship had been abandoned after the Clone Wars. Its hull was scarred by turbo laser fire, its corridors frozen in vacuum. Vader had sealed a single section, restoring power only to life support in that small space. Here, surrounded by the dead quiet of space, he would sit in meditation, letting the hum of the reactor merge with the pulse of the Force. Outside his chamber, frost crept along the walls, and the rest of the ship lay in perfect stillness, a monument to endings. On Mustafar, there was a sanctuary unlike any other. Not the great fortress known to the Emperor, but a smaller, older place. A basalt chamber built upon a jagged rock that jutted from the lava river itself, accessible only by a narrow bridge of stone. Here, the air was thick with heat. Every breath was a memory. Every step echoed with the moment that had destroyed Anakin Skywalker. He came here when he wished to remember pain at its purest. When he wished to keep the wound open. There were sanctuaries that no one would ever find, because they were not places but states of being. A drifting meditation chamber in the belly of an Imperial Star Destroyer, sound-proofed, sealed against intrusion. A remote cave on the ice world of Auto-Plutonia, where he could disappear into the stillness of snow. A shuttle hidden in a gas giant's upper atmosphere, where the endless storms rolled on for centuries. In these places, he experimented. Not with weapons, but with the Force itself. He would stretch out his senses until the galaxy blurred into vibrations and currents. He would focus on the smallest details, the way a grain of sand shifted in the wind, the ripple of air, as a predator stalked its prey light years away. Sometimes he would try to push beyond the present moment, to glimpse what lay ahead. He saw flashes, a hand reaching out, a mask falling to the floor, a star fading into darkness. There were other times when he reached backward instead. He would seek the boy he once was, the slave on Tatooine, the Jedi Padawan, the general leading legions of clones into battle. But the deeper he reached, the more those memories twisted. Faces blurred, voices changed, and he was never certain if what he saw was truth or invention. In the sanctuaries, Vader could remove the armor piece by piece. Not entirely. Life support was still necessary, but enough to feel the air against his scarred skin. He would close his eyes and try to remember what it was to breathe without machines. The memory never lasted. The sanctuaries were also where he came when the Emperor's leash grew too tight. Here, there were no spies, no commands, no endless parade of officers and admirals, only the hiss of his own breath, the pulse of the Force, and the knowledge that these spaces were his alone. And in that solitude, he could dream, not of redemption, not of returning to the light, but of something greater than the Emperor, something greater than the Sith. In the stillness of these hidden places, Vader was not apprentice. He was not servant. He was simply the dark center of his own universe, and deep within the black heart of his sanctuaries, the galaxy could not touch him. The Emperor gave Vader many things: command of fleets, authority over the Inquisitors, the power to strike fear into entire systems with his presence alone. But there were things the Emperor would never give him: ancient knowledge, secrets the Sith had guarded for millennia, truths buried so deep that even the Jedi of the Old Republic had feared to touch them. Vader knew that Palpatine kept such knowledge close, hidden in vaults, locked in holocrons that only the Emperor's voice could open, stored in chambers shielded from the Force itself. But Vader was patient. He learned to read between his master's words. Every casual remark, every lecture on the nature of the dark side, every subtle warning about what not to seek. To Vader, these warnings were maps, and every map led somewhere. He began to build his own collection. Some pieces he took from Jedi temples before they could be destroyed. A holocron in the voice of a long-dead Jedi historian, speaking of battles fought before the Republic was born. A fragment of a scroll detailing the rituals of the ancient Sith species, written in a language so old that translation was as much guesswork as truth. Crystals engraved with symbols that hummed faintly in the presence of the dark side. Other pieces came from the Emperor himself, though not given willingly. When Palpatine sent Vader to destroy a heretic cult, the Sith Lord kept their sacred texts. When he was ordered to recover artifacts from ruined worlds, some never made their way back to Coruscant. They vanished into places only Vader could find. There were dangerous holocrons, ones that spoke to him in voices that were not human, that whispered promises of power beyond the grasp of the living, that showed visions of worlds burning, galaxies collapsing, and the Force itself unraveling. Some teachings were subtle, meditations that altered how he felt the current of the Force. Others were brutal, instructions for rituals that demanded blood, sacrifice, and the bending of life to one's will. He studied the works of Darth Vader, gleaning fragments about the balance between light and dark. He absorbed the strategies of Darth Malgus, learning how to turn a war not through fleets, but through the destruction of hope. He lingered on the writings of Darth Nihilus, whose hunger devoured entire worlds, not to replicate it, but to understand the raw will it required. He read of Darth Vitiate, who ruled for 1,000 years by bending death and time to his command. The Emperor never spoke of these names, perhaps because he feared their legacies, or perhaps because he saw himself in them and knew Vader might too. In his private sanctuaries, Vader would replay the lessons, listening to the voices of long-dead Sith over and over, testing their techniques in small, precise experiments, sometimes on objects, sometimes on prisoners, always in secret. There were moments when the knowledge threatened to consume him, when the rituals pulled at his mind like an undertow, when the visions from the holocrons blurred with reality, and he could not be certain whether he stood in the present or in some long-forgotten war. But Vader welcomed this danger, because danger meant power, and every piece of forbidden knowledge was a step toward freedom. Freedom from the Emperor's control, freedom from the chains of the past, freedom to shape the galaxy as he saw fit. There was one holocron he returned to more than any other. It was not ornate. It bore no markings. It was a simple black cube, cold to the touch. When activated, it did not speak at first. It simply opened a vision, a vast, endless plain beneath a dark sky, where a figure stood waiting. The figure was always different. Sometimes a warrior in crimson armor, sometimes a robed shadow with eyes like burning coals, sometimes a robed shadow with eyes like burning coals. The holocron never explained its purpose, never gave clear instructions, but Vader suspected it was showing him something more than history. It was showing him what he could become. The danger of forbidden knowledge was not only in its power, but in the way it changed how he saw the galaxy. Every Imperial officer, every planet, every battle, he began to view them not as tasks or conquests, but as pieces in an ancient game. A game the Sith had been playing since before the Republic existed, and he was no longer content to be someone else's piece. In the quiet of his sanctuaries, surrounded by relics that should not exist, Vader began to imagine what it would mean to take the game for himself, to hold the galaxy not as a servant of the Emperor, but as its true master. And in the flicker of the holocron's glow, those dreams began to take shape. Vader's mastery of the Force was no longer simply about combat. It had become a study, an obsession, a discipline honed in secret, far from the eyes of the Emperor, far from the fleets of the Empire, and far from the fear of the galaxy. In the hidden sanctuaries he built across the stars, he tested the limits of the dark side. Small experiments at first, moving objects with a mere thought, bending the air into currents that could shift a fragile vessel or extinguish a flame, sensing life forms before they even moved, predicting actions not from observation, but from the subtle vibration of their presence in the Force. Then the experiments grew bolder. Vader discovered that by combining physical pain with concentration, he could amplify his reach. The slightest pressure on a nerve, the smallest spark of heat or cold, became a conduit for the Force itself. He could push objects greater in size, influence the minds of small groups, and even twist energy in ways that defied traditional teachings. There were times when he would drift into meditation for days. Seated in the stillness of his chamber, respirator hissing, every muscle locked in tension, he would let the Force flow through him without interruption. Sometimes he would open himself to the galaxy, not merely sensing life, but the currents of entire systems. The ebb and flow of worlds, the balance of economies, the rise and fall of leaders. He could feel the tremor of rebellions before they formed, the subtle corruption of senators long before it reached the public eye. And in these meditations he began to realize the Force could be guided as water is guided through channels. Other experiments were dangerous. He would attempt to channel the Force through his mechanical body directly, bypassing the organic limits imposed by his injuries. The result was immense power and immense pain. Sparks would arc along his armor. Metal joints would strain under the unseen pressure. Sometimes he would collapse, barely holding on to life as the Force surged through him like lightning in a storm. Vader also explored memory manipulation. Careful, subtle nudges at first, making minor changes in the perceptions of those he interrogated, altering the way they remembered events by the smallest fractions of detail. Then he tried to do more, to influence entire communities, shaping belief without them realizing it. A word whispered in the mind, a fear planted in the shadows of sleep, a thought moved ever so slightly. These were not Jedi techniques, nor were they fully Sith. They were something uniquely his own. He experimented with life itself, creating minor conditions in which cells could be accelerated or slowed using the Force, testing the regenerative potential of tissue in his own body and on others. He sought to understand not only how to heal but how to extend life, and perhaps one day bend the rules of mortality altogether. One of his most dangerous pursuits was the amplification of Force presence. He found ways to extend his reach across systems, to make his influence felt even when he was light years away. Storms could shift at his command. Weak minds could falter in his absence. Ships would hesitate, pause, or lose power as though some invisible hand held them back. These tests were unpredictable. Sometimes the currents he tried to bend would snap back, leaving destruction in their wake. Entire facilities damaged by the unseen pressure of energy he had sought to control. The most esoteric of his experiments involved time. Not literal time travel, but glimpses into potential futures. By extending his consciousness into the Force, Vader could see the paths of individuals, the unfolding of battles, the probable outcomes of political maneuverings. These visions were never perfect. Sometimes they were warped, twisted by interference or his own desires. Yet he learned to interpret them, to separate the noise from the signal. There were dangers beyond understanding. The holocrons whispered to him during these experiments, some in voices soft and guiding, others harsh and demanding. Sometimes the boundary between the visions and reality blurred. He would awaken from meditation not knowing if he had moved in the material world or only in the currents of possibility. Yet in every failure there was learning. Every surge of pain taught him control. Every collapse of a structure or failure of an experiment taught him caution. And every glimpse into the unknown confirmed that the Force was not merely a tool. It was an extension of will. It was infinite. It was the bridge between what was, what is, and what could be. Vader's experiments made him more than a warrior. They made him a student of the universe itself. Every ship lost, every storm shaped, every mind influenced, every pulse of energy bent to his will. They were lessons. Each moment taught patience, focus, precision, and the terrifying beauty of power unchecked. And all the while, the galaxy slept, unaware, oblivious to the deep currents of Force manipulation that stretched across star systems, shaping the future even before it arrived. Vader alone knew the extent of his reach, and he alone carried the weight of its consequences. For in the endless quiet of his sanctuaries, amidst the hum of respirator, the pulse of the Force and the glow of forbidden holocrons, he realized one immutable truth. Power was not given. It was taken, and only those who dared push the boundaries could ever hold it. Vader's presence was not confined to the battlefield. It extended into places no one could see, not through brute force but through the subtle weaving of influence, intelligence, and unseen pressure. The Empire had its official eyes and ears. Inquisitors, officers, spies, and informants collected information with mechanical precision. Reports flowed in like streams into Coruscant, into the Emperor's throne room, where he would sift through them like a predator examining prey. But there were shadows the Emperor could not reach, paths Vader alone had opened. From the corridors of the Senate to the back alleys of industrial worlds, his agents moved. They were not all human. Some were droids, programmed with subtleties of deception, with methods that blurred the line between life and machinery. Some were alien, able to infiltrate places where humans could not. Some were former rebels or mercenaries, carefully bent to his will, indebted to him, or terrified enough to obey. Through them, he watched. He observed rebellions before they sparked, financial transactions, fleet movements, secret negotiations. Nothing escaped the subtle gaze of his network. And yet, his surveillance was not merely for control. It was experimentation, a way to see how systems, societies, and individuals bent under pressure, and how the Force interacted with them. He learned patience here. Patience and subtlety were as potent as any lightsaber or Force choke. Sometimes a whisper in the right ear could achieve more than the destruction of an entire fleet. Sometimes planting fear in a single influential individual could topple entire administrations. And Vader became an architect, unseen, of outcomes the galaxy believed were natural. There were secret meetings, not on starships, not on Imperial bridges, not in palaces. Private chambers concealed in abandoned space stations, orbiting unremarkable moons, hidden beneath cloaking fields and gravimetric distortions. There, he met with figures who owed him loyalty, fear, or the promise of survival. They brought him reports, artifacts, and intelligence from the far reaches of the galaxy. They whispered secrets of the rebels, of rogue Jedi survivors, of Imperial governors growing ambitious. Vader listened, and he guided. Vader's understanding of the Force gave him insight beyond conventional spies. He could sense when lies were told. He could feel hesitation, uncertainty, even the faintest flicker of ambition. Through this, he manipulated outcomes before actions were even taken. A subtle nudge here, a faint suggestion there, and entire systems would bend according to his vision, without a single fleet movement or open act of war. He even extended his reach into the Imperial bureaucracy. Letters, memos, requests, orders, everything was influenced. He shaped promotions, reassigned officers, created rivalries, and dissolved alliances. Every chain of command he touched became a tool for him to test control, experiment with influence, and measure the boundaries of obedience. Vader understood that fear alone was insufficient. Loyalty was unstable. Only the careful orchestration of observation, influence, and subtle threat could maintain true power. He became a shadow within shadows, a presence that was felt more than seen. Sometimes he allowed rebels or dissidents to believe they had evaded detection, to watch their confidence grow, their plans unfold, their mistakes multiply. Then, when the moment was perfect, he would not with violence at first, but with precision. A single word, a single movement, and the fragile web would collapse around them. Even Imperial officers feared him, though they rarely saw him directly. Some spoke of a presence in meetings, a weight in the room that bent discussions to silence. Others whispered of decisions made by unseen influence, orders appearing without explanation, fleets shifted without reason. And always, there was the question, how much of this was Palpatine, and how much was Vader himself? There were moments when he directly tested the limits of his unseen reach, sending ships into conflict zones without issuing orders, allowing captains to choose freely, then observing the consequences. A single miscalculation would cause failure, loss, or even destruction. And Vader learned not only how the Force interacted with the galaxy, but how the minds of men could be shaped by pressure, fear, and possibility. He understood networks, not only of spies but of influence. Every officer, every governor, every spy could be a node in a lattice of power. and he could send ripples through it, bending outcomes without revealing himself. The galaxy was his laboratory. Every rebellion, every alliance, every whisper of resistance, every fleeting hope, all data for his experiments in control. And yet, even as he manipulated systems, he remained disciplined. He never acted impulsively. Every decision was calculated, measured against its ripple through space, time, and the Force. Every action had purpose. Every silence was deliberate. Even the occasional indulgence in violence was a test, a demonstration of power, a way to measure reaction. Vader's mastery over the shadows of the Empire made him more than a general, more than an enforcer. He became a quiet architect of fate, invisible yet undeniable, a presence that shaped the galaxy without ever raising a hand. The Emperor may have believed himself the ultimate manipulator, but in secret Vader learned to bend even the grand designs of the Empire to his own vision. And in the quiet of his private chambers, surrounded by holocrons, star charts, and the faint hum of machinery, he would meditate, pondering the reach of his influence, considering the next move, and always imagining a galaxy that could belong not to Palpatine but to him. Vader's hunts were not always open battles. Not all Jedi met their end on blazing battlefields with fleets and armies arrayed against them. Some survived, some hid, some wandered through the galaxy, believing themselves forgotten, believing the Empire blind to their presence. He found them, not always through intelligence networks or Imperial reports, sometimes through the subtle currents of the Force. A tremor in the energy of a system, a faint call, almost instinctive, almost unintentional. A presence flickering like a candle across the void, signaling another life connected to the Force. Vader would track them patiently, across systems, through asteroid belts and nebulae, over frozen wastelands and molten worlds. He would observe from a distance, studying their patterns, where they traveled, what they ate, how they interacted with others. Even their meditations, subtle changes in breathing, postures, and gestures that revealed mastery or weakness. Some Jedi were masters of hiding. They adopted disguises. They altered appearances. They avoided planets with high traffic, slipping between remote moons and forgotten colonies. Yet the Force betrayed them. 7. Even the most careful concealment left traces, like footprints in a storm. Vader felt these traces, following them silently, without interference, waiting for the precise moment to act. When confrontations occurred, they were rarely straightforward. He did not always strike immediately. Sometimes he allowed Jedi to attempt resistance, to test their skills and knowledge. He studied them as they moved through duels with other Force-sensitive combatants, or even as they sparred alone with objects in meditation. Their techniques, their style, their adaptation to pressure, all were data points for him. In rare instances, a Jedi might sense him before he struck. They would feel a shadow at the edge of perception, a sudden weight in the air, a chill running along the spine, or a whispering tug in the currents of the Force. These encounters were delicate dances. Vader moved with precision, every step measured, every gesture deliberate. Some encounters ended quickly. The Jedi resisted briefly, and then fell to his mastery. But others were more prolonged. They fought with ingenuity, drawing on teachings older than the Republic. They adapted, countered, and sometimes even surprised him. In those moments he felt a fleeting echo of the boy he once was, the young Anakin Skywalker chasing mastery with boundless passion, before anger, fear, and loss had carved him into something else entirely. He also encountered Jedi who had abandoned the orders of the past. Some had rejected the Council, seeking solitude. Some had embraced teachings lost to time, calling upon rituals and meditations that bordered on legend. These encounters fascinated him. He observed not just for destruction but to understand the variations of the Force itself, how flexibility, creativity, or deviation from tradition affected power and perception. And then there were those who tempted him, Jedi who tried to reach the remnants of Anakin within him. through words, memories, and appeals to compassion or guilt. They sought to awaken what they believed was hidden, buried beneath layers of hate and obedience. Vader listened, but he did not respond, not with words, not with mercy. Each approach was weighed, each moment calculated, and yet, even in silence, the Force absorbed their intent. He learned from every encounter. Even victories taught lessons. Even failures or near misses revealed gaps in knowledge, perception, or control. Every Jedi he faced became part of his mental library, stored not as individuals but as examples of technique, strategy, and the depth of the Force. Sometimes, after confrontations, he would linger. He would stand over the battlefield, over the destroyed encampments or the remains of duel sites, and sense the lingering energy. The currents of fear, courage, defiance, or sorrow that he would meditate on how the Force had moved, how it had resisted, and how it had bent to his will. And in these quiet reflections, he learned patience beyond combat. He learned observation, subtlety, and the hidden power in restraint. The galaxy itself became a classroom. Every planet where a Jedi hid, every community influenced by their presence, every ripple caused by their actions or survival, all these were lessons in causality, in consequence, in how life and the Force intertwined. Even after victory, even after death, Jedi left impressions. Memories of their skill, their courage, their defiance echoed through the currents of the Force. Vader would feel these echoes long after the confrontation ended. They lingered in hidden spaces, in sanctuaries, and in the quiet of his meditations. He studied them, he understood them, and he incorporated their lessons into his own understanding of the galaxy, the Force, and his place within it. Clean. Through all these encounters, he became more than a hunter. He became a scholar of the living Force, a silent observer of potential and destiny. Every duel, every encounter, every observation added depth to his perception. It was not power alone that defined him. It was mastery, not of weapons or fleets, but of knowledge, presence, and understanding. And as he meditated on these experiences in the quiet of his sanctuaries, surrounded by holocrons, relics, and the distant pulse of the Force, he realized a subtle truth. The Jedi he hunted had taught him as much as the Emperor, and perhaps more. Vader's connection to the Force was not merely physical, not merely tactical. It was also temporal. It stretched beyond the present into glimpses of past and future, threads of possibility that he alone could perceive. In the quiet of his private chambers, with the hum of machinery and the pulse of life support systems surrounding him, he would meditate. He would sink into the currents of the Force, closing his eyes behind the mask, listening not to the world but to the galaxy itself. And in that silence, visions would come. Sometimes they were faint, like mist over water. Sometimes they were vivid, like fire burning through the darkness. He saw wars that had already been fought, battles of the past stretching like threads across the galaxy. He felt the decisions of Jedi and Sith who had long since passed. Their victories, their failures, their doubts, their moments of courage and terror. And he absorbed their lessons silently, without judgment, understanding the patterns that power, fear, and will created over time. Sometimes the visions were of the present, of events unfolding elsewhere. The flutter of a rebellion on a remote moon, the silent plotting of ambitious officers in the Imperial Navy, the whispers of political maneuvering that would not reach the Emperor's ear for weeks, months, sometimes years. Through the Force he felt these ripples before they became waves, and he could act with foresight few could imagine. But the most compelling visions were of the future. Not certainties, but possibilities, branches of potential that stretched infinitely. He would see worlds engulfed in fire, systems crushed by fleets, and empires rising and falling. He would see himself at times as the master of all, commanding galaxies without opposition. At other times he saw shadows of failure, loss, and despair, moments when his strength would falter and the very foundations of the empire would tremble. These visions were not always comforting. Some left him shaken, with a lingering weight pressing against his chest, a reminder that the future was never fixed. The Force showed him paths not yet taken, dangers not yet faced, and consequences not yet understood. Yet even in fear, he found clarity, because within the uncertainty of the future he saw opportunity. He learned to interpret the visions with precision, to distinguish the faint whispers of likelihood from the noise of chaos. He began to understand the subtle signs, the patterns that would indicate whether a future was emerging naturally or whether it was bending in response to his own actions. And he realized that in many ways the visions themselves were tools, just as powerful as any weapon. Vader also encountered visions that were cryptic, symbols, shapes and figures that defied logic, yet carried meaning if he could decipher them. A robed figure in shadow holding something that gleamed like a distant star. A child crying in a field of fire, surrounded by shapes he could not recognize. A throne, empty yet waiting, carved with markings older than any civilization still alive. Each image lingered long after the meditation ended, etched into his mind like carvings on stone. He began to see connections between visions and reality. Events would unfold that mirrored fragments he had glimpsed in dreams. Individuals he had seen in fleeting images would appear in reality, their actions reflecting his earlier visions. Sometimes he acted to accelerate the path he had seen. Sometimes he acted to divert it. And sometimes he simply waited, watching the Force reveal its course on its own. In these visions he also encountered glimpses of the Emperor's plans. Not as clear directives, but as currents in the Force, subtle shifts of intention and influence. He felt the Emperor reaching for the galaxy, shaping events with a hand that was at once omnipresent and invisible. And yet he saw gaps, moments when the Emperor's control faltered or when a shadow of doubt lingered. These gaps became opportunities for Vader, lessons in subtlety, patience and strategy. There were times when the visions became overwhelming, when past, present and potential future pressed against him simultaneously. The faces of Jedi and Sith, the cries of the dying, the whisper of storms, and the hum of fleets merged into a symphony of the Force itself. And yet, within that overwhelming torrent, he found serenity, because he had learned to anchor himself, to let the Force flow through him without being swept away, to observe without panic, and to act without hesitation. Vader also glimpsed shadows that might never come to pass. Figures who could rise from obscurity to challenge the Empire. Worlds untouched by war that could suddenly erupt. Allies who might betray, and enemies who might turn. These were warnings, not prophecies, possibilities, not certainties. Yet each informed his strategy, each shaped his meditation, each added depth to his understanding of the galaxy. The visions sometimes spoke in the language of emotion rather than sight. A sense of despair, of hope, of courage or of fear. An echo of passion from distant worlds. A pulse of hatred from hidden corners of the galaxy. Through these subtle currents, Vader learned not only what was happening, but how it felt to live in the spaces between events, between decisions, between choices. And always, the visions brought him back to himself, to the boy he once was, to the fear, anger, and grief that had shaped him, to the potential he saw in himself, both light and dark, intertwined and inseparable. He understood that the Force was a reflection, a mirror, and that the visions were both teacher and test. Through years of meditation, he refined the ability to reach deep into the currents of time and the Force. He could anticipate rebellion, foresee threats, and manipulate outcomes. Yet he never became arrogant. The visions reminded him constantly that nothing was certain, that the future was a living thing, fluid and responsive to every action, every thought, every breath. In the stillness of his sanctuaries, surrounded by holocrons, relics, and the hum of life support machinery, Vader reflected on these visions. He understood that his power was not just in his lightsaber, his fleets, or his physical mastery. It was in knowledge. It was in understanding. It was in the quiet, patient study of the galaxy itself and the hidden currents of the Force that bound it together. And as he sank deeper into meditation, The visions continued, stretching out across time, space, and possibility, guiding him, testing him, teaching him, shaping him, until he was no longer merely a servant of the Emperor, no longer merely a hunter of Jedi. He was a student, a master, and perhaps, in time, the one who could bend the very currents of destiny itself. Vader's fascination with the past was as intense as his control over the present. Not satisfied with the Empire's resources, not content with the knowledge the Emperor allowed, he sought what had been hidden for millennia. Ancient Sith holocrons, relics, and artifacts became the focus of secret expeditions, hidden in remote corners of the galaxy. Planets forgotten by time, shrouded in nebulae, cloaked in shadows. These were the places he sent his agents to retrieve objects long considered lost. Each artifact told a story, and Vader studied them with meticulous care. Holocrons, encoded with centuries of Sith knowledge, hummed with the weight of experience. Some whispered secrets of alchemy and the manipulation of life. Some revealed ancient dueling techniques, forgotten or forbidden by the Jedi and the Sith alike. Some contained prophecies, puzzles of language and imagery, warnings and promises of power, waiting for the patient and the bold to interpret. Vader approached these objects as both a student and a master. He would meditate for hours, sometimes days, in the presence of a holocron, absorbing its lessons through the Force itself. The whispers of the ancients became clear, not as sound, but as knowledge streaming into his consciousness. Sometimes they were painful, as if the Force itself resisted him, testing his resolve, measuring his strength, judging his purpose. In these sessions he experimented, not merely with combat, but with the manipulation of life and energy. Vader attempted to bend Force currents in ways that had never been documented, combining the teachings of the holocrons with his own innovations. Some experiments failed spectacularly. Energy would surge beyond control, tearing equipment apart, creating storms in the Force that left his chambers trembling and his body straining. Yet every failure was a lesson, every surge a test of endurance, focus, and understanding. He also explored artifacts designed to manipulate perception. Masks, amulets, and relics that could amplify fear, bend thought, or obscure reality. He studied the mechanisms behind their power, attempting to integrate them with his own mastery of the Force. Some worked only partially. Others produced results that bordered on terrifying, as if the universe itself was bending under the influence of his will. There were Sith lightsabers, ancient and powerful, crafted with techniques that were lost even to the most learned scholars of the dark side. Vader tested their crystals, their resonance with the Force, the way their energy flowed not only through the blade but through the wielder. Some lightsabers sang to him, aligning with his own aura and amplifying his power in ways he had never imagined. Others resisted, the dark energy contained within them warping or sparking in rebellion, forcing him to adapt, to temper, to master the flow rather than dominate it. He also encountered artifacts that were warnings as much as tools, statues, inscriptions, and devices that hinted at the dangers of overreaching, of succumbing to arrogance or desire. The holocron spoke of Sith who had tried to extend life, to manipulate the Force beyond natural limits, and had been destroyed by their own ambition. Vader considered these carefully, balancing caution with curiosity. He understood that knowledge without discipline could be fatal, that power without understanding could unravel everything he had built. Some artifacts tested the mind directly. Meditating with certain holocrons was like diving into an ocean of consciousness, where memories, experiences, and ambitions of the ancients flowed into him. At first he felt disoriented, as if he were a small vessel caught in a storm too large to comprehend. Thoughts of past Sith, their triumphs and failures, their betrayals and loyalties, merged into a torrent of insight and challenge. Vader learned to navigate these currents, to separate his own consciousness from the influx, and to extract lessons without losing himself. He also experimented with the combination of multiple artifacts, placing holocrons together, testing their resonances, studying the energy fields that pulsed between them. Some combinations were harmonious, amplifying his understanding. Others were catastrophic, creating bursts of energy that singed the edges of reality and left his sanctuaries trembling. Through trial, error, and meditation, he began to uncover principles lost to time, the underlying logic that connected ancient Sith knowledge with the modern dark side. Vader's fascination extended beyond physical artifacts. He studied Sith rituals, ceremonies, and practices, recorded only in fragmented texts or oral traditions preserved in secret sects. Some rituals involved energy manipulation, bending the dark side to influence entire star systems. Others were psychological, teaching domination of fear, mastery of perception, and the shaping of loyalty and despair. Vader practiced these rituals in solitude, measuring their effects on himself, on the Force around him, and occasionally on test subjects brought to him under strict observation. Through all of this, he became not just a master of the present, but a student of history, philosophy, and the arcane. The galaxy, with its wars, politics, and hidden currents, was a laboratory. Ancient Sith teachings were both tools and warnings. Every artifact, every holocron, every ritual was a key to understanding not only the past, but the path forward, a path that Vader alone could walk with full knowledge of its danger and promise. Vader's experiments with these ancient relics also deepened his connection to the Force in unexpected ways. He felt currents of energy that were not visible to ordinary senses, resonances of dark side energy stretching across time and space. He sensed echoes of Sith long dead, their knowledge flowing toward him like tributaries converging into a mighty river. Some were guides, some were warnings. All demanded focus, patience, and the discipline to absorb what was useful and discard what was irrelevant. Through these meditations and experiments, he began to understand something profound. The Force was not merely a tool. It was alive. It responded to knowledge, intent, discipline, and creativity. The artifacts, the holocrons, the rituals, they were conduits, but it was his mastery, his patience, and his will that activated their true potential. And as he sat in quiet contemplation, surrounded by these relics of power, Vader realized that he was no longer merely a servant of the Emperor. He was a scholar, a practitioner, a seeker of the deepest truths of the dark side. He was building something beyond fleets, beyond duels, beyond fear, a legacy of understanding, mastery, and dominion over forces the galaxy had only glimpsed. Vader's reach extended far beyond what most could perceive. The galaxy believed he was a servant, an enforcer, a figure of wrath and obedience. But in truth, he was far more subtle, far more patient, and far more cunning than anyone imagined. He cultivated alliances hidden from the Emperor's scrutiny. Not overt alliances, not official commands, but delicate, unspoken agreements. Worlds, governors, and officers who owed loyalty not directly to the Emperor, but to him personally. Some were indebted through fear, some through ambition, and some through gratitude for opportunities he had created in silence. These alliances were carefully structured. The governor might maintain his position only because Vader had shielded him from scrutiny, removing rivals without anyone knowing. A merchant consortium might flourish because Vader manipulated supply chains, redirecting resources and opportunities subtly. A minor underworld leader could rise in power, smuggling, spying, and information gathering, all under Vader's guidance. Vader's manipulations were delicate. He often allowed small rebellions, disputes, and conflicts to unfold, observing without interference. He watched ambition, greed, and loyalty play out like pieces on a board. Then, at the precise moment, he intervened in silence, tipping outcomes in ways no one would ever trace back to him. The Sith Lord also made use of intelligence networks beyond the formal Inquisitors, spies embedded in neutral systems, pirates loyal to no one but themselves, bounty hunters with hidden allegiance. All of these were tools he could employ to gather information, apply pressure, or create confusion. Through these networks, he monitored not only rebel activity but also the ambitions of Imperial officers. He could sense threats before they arose and opportunities before they became visible. Some alliances were built on shared purpose rather than fear. He would recognize talent, insight, or ruthlessness in others, and subtly encourage it. A promising officer might be given authority he did not yet deserve. A skilled smuggler might be offered routes and intelligence that expanded their reach. In each case, the benefit was twofold. The galaxy was influenced, and Vader learned more about strategy, loyalty, and the human capacity for ambition and fear. He also exploited tensions within the Empire itself. Rivalries, jealousy, and distrust could be redirected to serve his purposes. By playing factions against one another, he strengthened his own position and tested the limits of obedience and power. Sometimes he used rumors, carefully planted, to provoke actions that revealed weaknesses or opened doors to manipulation. At other times he used promises of support, subtle guidance, and unspoken authority to elevate individuals whose skills or cunning were of particular value. Vader's underworld manipulations were equally meticulous. He knew that the Empire's official reach was not absolute. Criminal syndicates, mercenary groups, and rogue operatives operated in the margins, often invisible to the Emperor. Vader could bend them to his will, offering protection, facilitating expansion, or threatening ruin. These were never permanent alliances, but temporary alignments carefully calibrated to benefit him in intelligence, security, or influence. He often used intermediaries, subtle whispers, and indirect gestures. A simple shipment redirected here, a warning issued through a second-hand contact to there. Each action seemed innocuous in isolation, but cumulatively they created a lattice of influence that spanned systems, factions, and sectors. Even in the rebel space, he had an eye. Not to spy directly, but to sense currents that could be exploited. Defections, betrayals, and internal conflicts within rebel cells were observed and recorded, not with haste, but with patient calculation. Vader understood that knowledge gained quietly could yield far greater results than forceful intervention. Some alliances were kept alive for years without detection. A governor or sector leader would benefit quietly from Vader's guidance and interference, believing their success to be self-earned. Yet every action, every promotion, every piece of intelligence was subtly shaped by him. He orchestrated the rise of individuals who could serve as instruments, buffers, or pawns, always maintaining ultimate control. He also cultivated the appearance of distance. Few officers ever met him personally. Even fewer understood the subtle chains of power linking them to him. He allowed them to believe their victories and successes were self-directed, while in truth he had nudged, guided, and shaped every outcome. Vader's manipulations extended to technology and infrastructure. Starship deployments, supply routes, communications networks, and even bureaucratic procedures were adjusted in ways that favored his plans. No one ever traced these shifts directly to him, yet every element aligned with the influence he exerted across the galaxy. The Empire itself became a tool, a web, a system that could be bent without breaking, if one understood the hidden levers and subtle rhythms of control. He also tested loyalty, sometimes subtly, sometimes more directly. A message altered, a resource delayed, a favor withheld, enough to observe reactions, understand motives, and assess resilience. Through these tests, he gained insight into fear, ambition, and trust. He could discern who would betray, who would serve, and who might challenge him if opportunity arose. Even in these manipulations, Vader remained disciplined. He did not act recklessly or allow emotion to cloud judgment. Each alignment, each interference, each hidden intervention was carefully measured against the galaxy, the Empire, and the Emperor himself. Patience, precision, and perception became his tools as much as the Force and the lightsaber. Through these secret alliances and manipulations, Vader became more than a general, more than a servant of the Emperor. He became an invisible architect of outcomes, a silent orchestrator of the galaxy's currents. Worlds moved, fleets shifted, rebellions erupted or faltered, all under his quiet influence. And yet the galaxy never knew it. The Emperor saw only obedience. Rebels saw only a shadow of fear and pawn. But Vader knew the truth. Control was not merely domination, but subtlety, patience, and the careful shaping of events from behind the veil. And as he retreated to the quiet of his sanctuaries, surrounded by holocrons, relics, and the hum of the Force itself, he reflected. All these secret alliances, manipulations, and invisible levers of power were pieces of a greater design. A design that extended far beyond fleets, battles, and duels. A design that was as much about knowledge, observation, and patience as it was about destruction. In the silence, Vader understood the ultimate truth of control, that the greatest power was often invisible, unseen, and unfelt, yet shaping everything with quiet certainty. In the quiet solitude of his chambers, Vader often allowed himself moments of reflection. Not the reflection of a general or a Sith Lord, but of a man, a shadow of the boy he once had been, the weight of years, of choices, and of power pressed upon him. And in that weight he found fragments of memory that were both painful and illuminating. He remembered the past as a haze at first. The laughter of friends long gone, the sunlight falling across Tatooine's dunes, the warmth of a mother's love, and the sense of wonder in the galaxy beyond. Then, the moments of ambition, of yearning for greatness, of fear and anger that had led him down a path from which there seemed no return. He recalled the Jedi Council, the missions, the promises made and broken, and the inevitable confrontation with destiny that had shaped him into Darth Vader. In these meditations he examined the choices that had bound him to the dark side. Each decision, each act of anger or fear, became a lesson in the fragility of morality and the consequences of unchecked desire. He considered the lives lost, the worlds destroyed, and the rebellion sown by his own hand. The Force carried their echoes, and he could feel them, not as ghosts but as currents of energy that lingered in the galaxy like footprints in sand. Yet within the darkness, he also felt flickers of what might have been. Moments in which a different choice could have led to salvation rather than ruin, to love rather than fear, to connection rather than isolation. These fleeting glimpses were like faint stars in the black void, small, distant, yet infinitely powerful in the mind of one who sought meaning. Vader contemplated the legacy he would leave, not as a Sith, not as a servant, but as a being whose influence would ripple through time. He imagined the galaxy long after the Empire had fallen, long after the Emperor had been forgotten, and even long after he himself had ceased to exist. What remnants of him would survive in memory, in legend, in the currents of the Force itself? Would he be remembered solely as a harbinger of fear, or would fragments of the man beneath the mask endure? In these moments, Anakin's presence would sometimes flicker within him. The boy he had been, the young Jedi who had believed in hope and justice, whispering faintly in the recesses of consciousness. It was not a loud voice, nor one that demanded attention, but a quiet reminder of what could have been, and perhaps what might still be. Vader did not always welcome it, yet he could not ignore it. It was part of him, inseparable from the power, the pain, and the knowledge he carried. He meditated on redemption, a concept both distant and compelling. Not the simple return to light, but a more nuanced reclamation of self, a recognition of the harm caused and the choices made. He understood that true redemption was neither immediate nor certain, but a process, a journey that required courage, reflection, and the willingness to confront one's deepest failures. Even as Darth Vader, he could sense this possibility, faint and fragile, yet persistent. The galaxy's response to his actions was a constant meditation in itself. Planets ravaged, systems dominated, and people lived under the shadow of his power. Yet he also perceived subtle threads of life, hope, and resistance that persisted despite his dominance. Rebels who survived, systems that endured, and individuals who acted in defiance. These were signs that the galaxy was alive, vibrant, and complex. And they reminded him that power alone did not define existence. Connection, choice, and consequence were equally potent. In the solitude of these reflections, he contemplated mortality. The mask, the armor, the mechanical body, all served to preserve life, yet also reminded him of the fragility of flesh and the inevitability of decay. He considered what it meant to endure beyond the body, to leave an imprint not just through fear, or domination, but through knowledge, influence, and the subtle shaping of events. Even the Emperor, with all his power, would fade, and the galaxy would remember only fragments of his reign. Vader recognized that mortality gave weight to legacy, and that the manner of remembrance could define meaning in ways action alone never could. He pondered the concept of destiny. The Force, the currents of life and energy that shaped all things, had led him to this point. Yet he also realized that destiny was not absolute. Choice, action, and restraint could bend the current, altering outcomes in ways subtle and profound. Even now he had agency, even within the structures of the Empire and the shadow of the Emperor. He could act, influence, and shape events with patience, insight, and discipline. Memories of Padme Amidala occasionally surfaced, not as longing or love alone, but as a reminder of the world he had lost, the innocence and compassion that once guided him. Her presence in memory was like a distant melody, faint but resonant, weaving through the dark tapestry of his thoughts. He considered the children he had never known, the lives that might have been nurtured, the family that could have existed beyond war and fear. These reflections were neither sorrowful nor joyous, but contemplative, providing depth to his understanding of himself and the galaxy. He also reflected on the Jedi he had destroyed, the Order he had dismantled, not with satisfaction, but with recognition of the consequences of power and fear. The ghosts of their influence lingered in the Force, faint and subtle, shaping currents of hope and resistance. Even in their absence, he sensed the impact of their teachings, the resilience of their philosophy, and the ways the Force would continue to balance itself over time. Through these meditations, Vader began to integrate the duality within himself. The dark side, with its power, discipline, and fear. The remnants of Anakin Skywalker, with his capacity for hope, connection, and reflection. He recognized that the mask and the armor did not erase the man beneath, nor did his actions fully define the soul within. Instead, they were layers, elements of a whole that was complex, multifaceted, and capable of insight beyond simple dichotomies. He contemplated the future, not only in terms of war and conquest, but in terms of influence, knowledge, and the legacy of the Force itself. Would his actions echo for centuries, shaping the galaxy beyond the reach of memory or documentation? Would the choices he made in silence, in shadow, be felt as ripples across generations of Force-sensitive beings, shaping thought, philosophy, and understanding? These questions had no immediate answers, yet their presence guided reflection, strategy, and the quiet pursuit of mastery. In the stillness, surrounded by holocrons, Sith artifacts, and the hum of machinery that sustained life, Vader found a strange serenity. The meditations were not about fear, domination, or immediate power, but about understanding, perspective, and the subtle interplay of destiny, choice, and consequence. He realized that even within the constraints of the dark side, even under the shadow of the Emperor, there was a space for contemplation, insight, and subtle redemption. And as the hymn of the galaxy pulsed through the Force, he allowed himself to imagine a time when the boy and the Sith might coexist, not as enemies, not as absolutes, but as facets of a single enduring presence. A presence that would shape history, that would influence destiny, and that would persist in ways both visible and invisible, through memory, action, and the currents of the Force itself. In these long hours of meditation, Vader understood that true power was not merely physical, tactical, or even mystical. It was reflective. It was understanding. It was mastery of the self as much as mastery of the galaxy. And in that understanding, in that patient, deliberate reflection, he glimpsed the faintest trace of what might still be called hope. Vader's pursuit of knowledge extended beyond the limits of holocrons, beyond the written and recorded teachings of the Sith. He sought what had been lost, forgotten, or deliberately concealed over millennia, fragments of power that existed only in shadow or legend. These were secrets whispered in ancient texts, buried in tombs, encoded in symbols, and hidden on worlds long abandoned. They were the echoes of Sith who had lived before history, before empires, before even the Jedi had taken their first steps into galactic consciousness. In the vast silence of the galaxy, Vader found temples of stone and metal, ruins overgrown with alien flora, and tombs untouched by time. He explored corridors of darkness, feeling the resonance of the Force that had lingered, thick and heavy, for centuries. Every step was careful, deliberate, measured, because he understood that these places were not merely traps of flesh and steel, but of energy and intent. Some corridors hummed with residual power, vibrations in the Force that could unbalance a mind unprepared. Some chambers were silent, yet spoke to him through the currents of memory and energy, conveying lessons in a language older than words. Vader discovered writings etched into stone, metal, and crystal. Languages that had evolved and disappeared, scripts that only the Force could translate fully, revealing insights into the philosophies, strategies, and magics of ancient Sith. He studied these texts in solitude, meditating for hours or days, letting their resonance fill his consciousness. Some teachings were practical, instructions on energy manipulation, life extension, or the construction of weapons attuned to the dark side. Others were philosophical, pondering the nature of power, the duality of the Force, and the inevitability of conflict and transformation. Vader also discovered artifacts, unlike any holocron, relics that were alive in the Force. Crystals that pulsed with energy, statues that seemed to observe him, and devices whose function could only be understood through touch and meditation. Some artifacts responded to intent, shifting, glowing, or vibrating when the correct emotion or focus was applied. Others were protective, resisting interference until the user had proven themselves worthy or disciplined enough to interact without error. Through these objects, Vader learned lessons the holocrons could not teach, subtleties of energy, patience, and the interplay of mind and Force that had been lost over centuries. He uncovered the rituals of Sith alchemy and transmutation, some designed to alter matter, some to transform the body or extend life. He experimented with these in secrecy, using both his knowledge and the Force itself to explore possibilities that others would consider heretical. Some experiments were controlled, minor manipulations of energy, but others were vast, resonating across chambers, shaking the very foundations of the structures that held them. Each success reinforced his mastery, each failure offered insight, and every experiment taught him not only about the Force but about the balance between patience, discipline, and ambition. Vader discovered Sith teachings about the manipulation of emotion and will, techniques that allowed one to bend loyalty, fear, and desire across vast distances. These techniques were subtle, almost imperceptible, requiring a mastery of the self before attempting to influence others. He practiced these techniques quietly, observing the subtle changes in the minds of those around him, the shift of intention, and the flow of allegiance without ever alerting them to his interventions. Some teachings were designed to amplify anger and hatred in opponents, others to instill doubt and hesitation. Vader integrated these lessons with his own understanding, creating methods that combined ancient wisdom with modern application, shaping influence in ways few could perceive or resist. He also studied the principles of Sith foresight, techniques to glimpse potential futures and interpret currents of the Force beyond immediate perception. These methods were dangerous, requiring a complete immersion of mind and spirit, a surrender to the patterns of the galaxy, while maintaining clarity of intent. Vader learned to balance these currents, to predict not only movements of fleets and individuals but also shifts of ideology, rebellion, and ambition across entire systems. Some visions were faint and unclear, others startling in their clarity, but all contributed to his understanding of causality, consequence, and the subtle shaping of destiny. In the deepest chambers of forgotten Sith tombs, Vader encountered teachings that blurred the line between life and death. Methods to preserve consciousness, bind spirits, or transfer knowledge beyond physical existence. He meditated on these possibilities, not for immortality alone, but to comprehend the boundaries of the Force and the potential of mastery over existence itself. Some techniques were perilous, capable of overwhelming the mind or severing connection with the living world entirely. Yet Vader studied them with patience, absorbing the lessons without succumbing to the temptation of reckless experimentation. He uncovered writings and inscriptions detailing conflicts between Sith of ages past, rivalries and alliances that shaped the course of galactic history. These lessons were subtle but vital, teaching strategies of deception, timing and patience in ways that even the Emperor's instruction could not. He compared these ancient conflicts with his own, searching for patterns, understanding motivations, and refining his ability to anticipate moves, reactions, and consequences across both individuals and systems. Vader also discovered hidden accounts of Force-sensitive individuals who had walked the galaxy alone, mastering obscure techniques without the guidance of Sith or Jedi orders. These solitary practitioners had left no holocrons, no formal records, only the residue of their knowledge etched into objects, inscriptions, and the Force itself. He felt their presence, subtle yet powerful, and studied the ways they had harnessed energy, manipulated perception, and survived through cunning, strength, and insight. In learning from them, he extended his own understanding beyond what was codified, embracing the fluid, living nature of the Force. In time, these explorations changed him subtly, not in appearance, nor in the overt wielding of power, but in awareness, insight, and patience. He became attuned to nuances in the Force that others missed, reading currents, shifts, and undercurrents that hinted at future movements and hidden threats. He began to see patterns in rebellion, diplomacy, and ambition, understanding not only action but intention, not only consequence but influence. Even as he continued to serve the Emperor and execute the will of the Empire, he nurtured these private studies with meticulous care. No one could observe them, no report could capture them, and yet they shaped him profoundly, enhancing his mastery over the dark side and over the galaxy itself. Vader's encounters with these forgotten secrets taught him humility as well as power. He learned that even the mightiest Sith could err, that arrogance could destroy, and that the Force itself was neither entirely controllable nor predictable. Every ancient teaching, every artifact, every technique reminded him that mastery was not an endpoint, but a continuous journey, one that required patience, awareness, and respect for the currents that bound all things. Through these secret studies, he began to see a broader vision of himself and his place in history. Not merely as a Sith, nor simply as a servant, but as a being who could bridge the ancient and the present, the hidden and the apparent, the dark and the complex subtleties of life and Force alike. He realized that the galaxy was a living, breathing entity, and that his understanding, patience, and wisdom could influence its currents more profoundly than brute force ever could. And in these long, solitary hours, surrounded by ruins, artifacts, and the quiet hum of the Force, Vader contemplated the magnitude of what he had learned. He understood the fragility of power, the necessity of patience, the weight of knowledge, and the infinite possibilities that stretched across time, space, and the living fabric of the galaxy. He saw himself as a link, a conduit, a presence that would endure in subtle ways, shaping thought, action, and destiny, even beyond the reach of fleets, armies, and empires. Vader's awareness extended far beyond the battlefield, beyond the sight of commanders and spies, beyond even the intelligence networks that the Empire maintained. He perceived the subtle undercurrents of unrest, the faint currents of rebellion that whispered across systems like soft wind through a forest, barely noticeable but persistent. No report, no dispatch, no interrogation could convey what he sensed with the Force. It was a living, breathing pattern, shifting and flowing, fragile yet resilient. From his meditation chambers aboard the Executor and other sanctuaries, he would observe fleets and communications with a quiet focus, tracing patterns of movement, ideology, and intention. A supply route disrupted here, a rumor spread there, the faintest hesitation in a governor's decision. All became threads in a tapestry that he could read more clearly than any officer or droid. He understood the rebellion not only as a collection of ships, cells, and fighters, but as a living organism, dynamic, adaptive, and cunning in ways that mirrored the Force itself. Vader studied the leaders of the rebellion with particular care. He observed their decisions, their alliances, and their mistakes, learning their psychology as much as their strategy. Each moment of hesitation, Each act of courage or fear became a lesson in predicting future movements, understanding vulnerabilities, and shaping outcomes before they had fully manifested. He noted the way hope was cultivated and spread, the subtle mechanisms of morale, loyalty, and trust, and he reflected on how these could be countered, influenced, or anticipated. Even minor rebel actions caught his attention. A single sabotage mission, a hidden supply cache, or a clandestine communication revealed patterns of risk and adaptation. He studied these in silence, recording each movement in his mind, tracing its significance across sectors, and calculating potential impact on both local systems and the larger rebellion. Every act, no matter how small, was a signal, a piece of data flowing through the force that connected individual initiative to larger consequences. Vader's observations were not limited to action alone. He discerned philosophy, ideology, and emotion within the rebellion, sensing the subtle differences between genuine conviction and strategic pretense. He understood the fears, hopes, and ambitions of both leaders and followers, perceiving the ways in which each cell inspired or undermined another. Through this insight, he built a mental map, a web of relationships, strengths, and vulnerabilities that stretched across the galaxy. He also considered the impact of his own presence on their development. The shadow of Vader, the specter of the dark side, influenced actions without direct confrontation. Ships moved cautiously, leaders hesitated, and cells sometimes fractured simply due to the fear and anticipation of what might come. He realized that indirect influence could be as powerful as direct combat, that observation and perception could shape the rebellion as much as strategy or firepower. Vader's analysis extended to the psychological. He considered not only the resources and tactics of the rebellion, but the ways in which individuals reacted under stress, under uncertainty, under the perception of threat. He anticipated decisions based on character, predicting how fear, hope, and ambition might interplay to produce success or failure. This understanding allowed him to manipulate events subtly, adjusting patrols, supply lines, and communications to encourage certain outcomes while discouraging others, without leaving any trace of intervention. He paid attention to patterns in leadership succession and internal conflict. The rebellion was not monolithic. It contained rivalries, disagreements, and ambitions that he could perceive and exploit. The dispute between officers here, a miscommunication between cells there, became leverage, a hidden tool to shape the trajectory of their resistance without firing a single shot. Even the smallest hint of dissent or disillusionment became a data point, informing his understanding of loyalty, resilience, and the probability of collapse or endurance. Vader also studied the symbolism and myth-making of the rebellion. How stories of victories, losses, and heroic acts spread, shaping morale and inspiring action. He understood that these were not merely propaganda but tangible forces that influence behavior, allegiance, and strategy. By observing these patterns, he could predict where the rebellion might act next, how it would inspire or falter, and how to counterbalance the effects without direct engagement. He reflected on the timing of intervention. Sometimes, he would allow the rebellion to act unchecked, observing the outcomes with patient calculation. Failures and missteps revealed weaknesses and vulnerabilities, teaching him more than immediate victory could. Other times, he would intervene with precision, striking at a key moment, reshaping events without leaving evidence of his hand, leaving the rebellion unaware of the influence shaping their fate. Vader's understanding extended to recruitment and ideology. He sensed the motivations that drew individuals to the rebellion: desperation, hope, ambition, fear, and idealism, and considered how these could be disrupted, mirrored, or redirected. He realized that the movement was resilient not because of force alone, but because of belief, narrative, and conviction. While influencing perception subtly, through rumors, threats, or the quiet reshaping of opportunity, he could steer behavior without overtly engaging, a testament to the silent power of insight. He also observed alliances and networks, noting connections between systems, leaders, and cells. Some were strong and interdependent, others fragile and tenuous, yet all contributed to the living organism of the rebellion. He traced these connections through subtle signs, movements of ships, coded transmissions and patterns of trade, supply and communication. Each insight added to the mental map he carried within him, a lattice of knowledge that extended across the galaxy. Vader's observations were patient and continuous. He did not rush analysis, nor did he act hastily. He allowed events to unfold in time, measured responses, and understood the rhythms of the rebellion as one might study tides or wind currents. His understanding grew with every passing cycle, revealing patterns that might not be apparent to commanders, spies, or droids acting only on data or orders. He began to anticipate not only movement but intention, not only action, but the subtle currents of fear, hope, and ambition that drove every decision. Even when the rebellion succeeded temporarily, Vader viewed it with comprehension rather than anger alone. Victory and defeat were parts of the same pattern, lessons embedded in outcomes, guiding future strategy and perception. He studied every triumph, every mistake, and every subtle success, not only to counter them but to understand them, to grasp the living essence of resistance and the interplay between power and will. Through this silent observation, Vader became both shadow and teacher, witness and influence, a master of perception as well as force. He knew the rebellion would continue to rise and fall, to struggle and adapt, but his understanding of its nature allowed him to shape outcomes with subtlety and precision beyond the capacity of conventional command. Even the leaders who believed themselves autonomous were unknowingly participating in a pattern he discerned and influenced, a dance orchestrated in silence, in thought, and in force sensitivity. And as the galaxy shifted and changed, as planets lit with rebellion or shadow, Vader's silent gaze never wavered. He remained patient, observing, analyzing, and shaping, knowing that true mastery required not only power and skill, but insight, endurance, and the quiet comprehension of the living, breathing organism that was the galaxy itself. Vader often spent hours in reflection, considering not only the galaxy and the rebellion, but the Emperor himself, the architect of his rise and the shadow that loomed over every action he had taken. Palpatine was not merely a ruler or a Sith. He was a presence, an embodiment of cunning, patience, and dark power that extended across time, space, and the currents of the Force itself. Vader recognized that the Emperor's influence was pervasive, shaping events subtly, manipulating ambitions, and orchestrating outcomes in ways that were nearly imperceptible to all but the most attuned. And yet, within this influence he saw a pattern, a rhythm, a set of principles and tendencies that, if carefully studied, could reveal both opportunity and limitation. He reflected on his own position, the duality of being both master and servant, a conduit of power yet constrained by loyalty, fear, and obligation. He considered the tension between obedience and ambition, between loyalty and self-preservation, recognizing that the Emperor's power over him was both external and internal, maintained as much by fear as by understanding. Vader's mind often wandered through possibilities, examining outcomes not yet realized, contemplating moves and countermoves in a galaxy that was vast and ever-changing. He calculated risks with precision, not only in terms of fleets and politics, but in the delicate psychology of his master, understanding that even someone as cunning as Palpatine had limitations, blind spots, and predictable patterns of manipulation. He studied the Emperor's methods, his use of deception, fear, and the dark side as tools not merely of power, but of control over perception, loyalty, and action. Vader understood that Palpatine's strategy was multi-layered, encompassing not only military conquest, but the subtle shaping of ideology, the orchestration of conflict, and the cultivation of fear as a universal instrument. Yet in observing this, Vader also discerned the faintest signs of vulnerability, moments when the Emperor's focus might falter, when ambition could override prudence, when arrogance could cloud judgment. These insights were not trivial. They were lessons in patience, timing, and the careful accumulation of influence, and they occupied his thoughts as a silent, ongoing study of both power and survival. He reflected on the nature of obedience, recognizing that it was not merely external, but internal, a condition cultivated by habit, fear, and the careful shaping of perception over time. Vader recognized that mastery of self, understanding of motivation, and subtle adaptation were essential in navigating this relationship without succumbing entirely to control. He considered the ways in which even the Emperor relied on intermediaries, illusions, and layers of misdirection, realizing that insight could reveal both opportunities and dangers hidden beneath appearances. And he contemplated the limits of the dark side itself, understanding that while power could be immense, it required discipline, focus, and a careful management of ambition to avoid destruction from within. Vader's thoughts also turned inward, to his own legacy, mortality, and the possibility of influence beyond the reach of the Emperor. He reflected on the tension between service and self, the need to balance obedience with awareness, and the possibility of shaping events subtly to prepare for eventual independence. These contemplations were not reckless or impulsive. They were measured, deliberate, and guided by decades of experience in war, diplomacy, and force mastery. He understood that direct confrontation with Palpatine was impossible without precise timing, preparation, and understanding of the full spectrum of consequences, yet he also recognized that the potential existed, waiting for the right moment. Vader considered the Emperor's perception of him, the mixture of expectation, manipulation, and caution. He knew Palpatine regarded him as both instrument and apprentice, a vessel for power and a key component in long-term plans, yet also as an individual whose ambition and skill could eventually exceed limitations if carefully cultivated. This duality required vigilance, patience, and the continuous assessment of timing, opportunity, and risk. Every mission, every act of execution, every demonstration of loyalty was not merely service, but a data point, a measure of both perception and influence, shaping how the Emperor regarded him and how Vader positioned himself within that perception. He contemplated contingency, the planning of events several steps ahead, the preparation for outcomes that might seem unlikely, but were always possible. Every maneuver against the rebellion, every consolidation of imperial power, every secret study of ancient Sith knowledge fed into this matrix of foresight. Vader understood that his life, his influence, and his legacy depended not only on strength but on wisdom, patience, and the ability to perceive beyond the immediate, beyond the obvious, and beyond the manipulations of others. In these reflections, he also considered morality, not as a limitation, but as a measure of consequence. Every decision, whether to act with restraint or to exert power, had ripples, both visible and hidden, that extended through systems, populations, and the currents of the Force. He weighed these effects carefully, understanding that control without understanding could lead to collapse, while insight combined with power could yield influence that extended far beyond the battlefield. Even small decisions, seemingly trivial, could echo across years, shaping perception, loyalty, and action in ways immeasurable to those who lacked patience and foresight. He contemplated legacy in solitude, imagining the galaxy long after both he and the Emperor had faded, considering the ways in which memory, legend, and influence would endure. Would he be remembered only as the instrument of destruction, or as a figure whose subtle insight shaped events across decades? Would his understanding of both rebellion and empire survive in whispers, in interpretation, in the memory of those who had not even yet been born? He knew that such considerations were abstract, yet vital, because power without perspective was incomplete, and survival without foresight was fleeting. Vader also reflected on potential alliances and betrayal, recognizing that even the Emperor's power had limits. He considered contingencies in which the galaxy shifted, in which the balance of power altered, and in which he might act decisively to shape outcomes in secret, long before confrontation could become inevitable. These scenarios were complex, layered, and dangerous, requiring careful calculation, deep understanding of both people and force, and the patience to wait for precise alignment of conditions. Every factor, every subtle shift in perception, every ripple in allegiance was observed, considered, and integrated into his understanding of future possibilities. In quiet moments, Vader also contemplated himself, the duality of the man and the machine, the former Jedi and the Sith apprentice. He reflected on the mask, the armor, the mechanical body, and how they shaped perception, both of others and of himself. He considered the interplay of fear, power, and influence, and how subtle understanding of perception could be as powerful as fleets, weapons, or raw force strength. He understood that identity itself was a tool, a construct that could be leveraged to influence, to manipulate, and to survive, yet it also required constant reflection to maintain clarity and purpose. Through all of these contemplations, he maintained patience. He did not rush events, nor did he act without consideration. He allowed currents to unfold, individuals to reveal themselves, and the galaxy to move in ways that provided both opportunity and clarity. And in this patient observation, he cultivated a quiet mastery over circumstance, perception, and consequence that few could rival, blending power, insight, and strategic foresight into a singular presence. Vader's reflections on the Emperor and his own future were not merely intellectual exercises. They were meditations on survival, influence, mastery, and the eternal interplay of choice and destiny. He understood that ultimate power required both patience and vision, that influence was built as much on perception and understanding as on combat and force prowess. And in these long hours of contemplation, he nurtured the subtle strategies, the hidden pathways, and the awareness necessary to shape not only the present, but the future of the galaxy itself. In the silence of space, aboard the cold corridors of the Executor, Vader often allowed himself to drift into thought, letting the hum of engines and the subtle vibrations of the Force surround him. He reflected on decades of action, conflict, and study, considering both the victories and the failures, the choices that had shaped him, and the lessons he had gathered in solitude and battle alike. Every mission, every duel, every confrontation had been both a test and a teacher, revealing not only the nature of the galaxy, but the nature of himself. He thought of the Jedi he had been, the ideals he once upheld, and the path that had diverged so drastically from hope and light into darkness and shadow. And yet he did not dwell in regret. He observed it as one might study history, with clarity, detachment, and the knowledge that each choice had led him to a place of unparalleled understanding and power. 7. The mask, the armor, the breathing that echoed with mechanical precision. These were not merely tools of survival, but symbols of transformation, markers of a journey through darkness into mastery. He reflected on the Emperor, on the subtle interplay of obedience and manipulation, loyalty and ambition, and the intricate web that had defined their relationship. Palpatine's shadow had loomed over him, shaped his actions, and guided the galaxy through fear. Yet Vader had learned through observation and experience the subtle nuances of influence, timing, and understanding. He contemplated the nature of control itself, realizing that true mastery required not only power, but insight, patience, and the quiet understanding of consequence. The rebellion, too, was ever present in his thoughts, a living, breathing organism of hope, fear, and determination that moved across systems, striking where opportunity and courage intersected. Vader observed it continuously, noting the flow of allegiance, the shifts in morale, the subtle interplay of action and reaction, understanding that the galaxy was never static, never predictable, but always alive. He considered each leader, each cell, each fighter, tracing motivations, weaknesses, and strengths, and blending these observations into a continuous mental map of influence and foresight. He thought of Anakin Skywalker, the boy from Tatooine, the Jedi Knight, and the man who had become both machine and shadow. All identities, all layers, all histories converged within him, shaping his perception of the Force, the galaxy, and the role of a being who straddled life, death, hope, and fear. He meditated on memory and identity, understanding that each past self contributed to insight, resilience, and the capacity to act with both precision and wisdom. Vader also reflected on the ancient Sith, the teachings buried in time and shadow, the knowledge that had survived in ruins, inscriptions, and artifacts. He considered the lessons of the past, the ambitions, rivalries, and triumphs of those who had wielded the dark side before him, and he integrated them into his understanding of power, patience, and consequence. The whispers of Vitiate, the hunger of Darth Nihilus, the cunning of Revan, the ruthlessness of Malgus, all resonated in the Force, teaching him subtleties that even the Emperor's instruction could not fully convey. He contemplated mortality, not as an endpoint but as a continuity within the Force, the eternal flow of energy and awareness that connected all life, death, and power. He understood that even as flesh failed and the body succumbed to time or injury, the essence, the consciousness, the legacy of influence could endure through both perception and energy. Every action, every lesson, every observation contributed to this continuity, forming a pattern that extended beyond individual life, beyond immediate control, and into the tapestry of the Force itself. In solitude, he contemplated restraint and temptation, the interplay of desire, power, and consequence that defined every choice he had made. He recognized that the dark side offered immediacy, strength, and dominance, but also carried the risk of self-destruction, arrogance, and imbalance. He had learned, through countless hours of reflection and engagement, that patience, awareness, and subtlety were as essential to mastery as raw power, and that foresight could shape events far beyond the reach of fleets or armies. Vader thought about fear and hope, understanding that both were instruments of influence, capable of shaping behavior, allegiance, and perception across the galaxy. He had witnessed fear driving rebellion, hope driving defiance, and both forces interacting in unpredictable ways, and he had learned to observe, guide, and subtly manipulate without overt intervention. These lessons were not simply tactical, but philosophical, revealing the intricate interplay between emotion, perception, and action within both individuals and societies. He also considered the flow of time, the inevitability of change, and the impermanence of institutions, empires, and lives. The empire itself, vast and powerful, was a construct of influence, perception, and enforcement. Yet even it would eventually shift, evolve, or fade, leaving only memory, record, and the currents of the Force. Vader's understanding of this impermanence shaped his actions, his patience, and his vision, allowing him to operate with both immediacy and long-term foresight, preparing for contingencies that stretched decades into the future. He reflected on the interconnectedness of all things, perceiving the subtle threads that linked events, decisions, and actions across time and space. He saw that every battle, every negotiation, every choice, and every study was not isolated, but part of a living web of consequence that extended across the galaxy. And he understood that by observing, understanding, and acting with awareness, he could influence not only outcomes, but the perception, memory, and alignment of forces that shaped the galaxy's flow. Vader's reflections often turned to the future of the Force itself, the balance between light and dark, and the enduring struggle that had defined history for millennia. He contemplated the Jedi, their resilience and their limitations, understanding both their wisdom and their rigidity, their hope and their vulnerability. He considered the dark side, its power, its allure, and its dangers, understanding that mastery required not only ambition but comprehension, discipline, and foresight. He thought of potential successors, those who might rise in the galaxy, carry forward knowledge, and influence destiny, either to challenge or continue the patterns he had observed and shaped. He understood that influence could survive beyond presence, that insight could shape events in subtle ways even after the body and consciousness had faded, and that legacy was as much perception as action. Vader contemplated this with patience, not as a ruler or conqueror, but as a guardian of knowledge, a practitioner of the Force, and a being who had walked the spectrum of light and dark, understanding both intimately. In these meditations he found a strange serenity. Not peace, for that was never possible, nor freedom, which had its own costs, but clarity, understanding, and the quiet satisfaction of mastery, tempered by observation. He recognized the impermanence of control, the necessity of patience, and the power of perception, and he allowed himself to rest in these truths as one might rest upon the soft hum of the galaxy itself. Vader's final reflections were both profound and subtle, encompassing memory, strategy, philosophy, and the endless flow of the Force. He understood that life and death, hope and fear, obedience and defiance were not merely opposites, but points along a spectrum of influence and understanding, each interacting with the other across time and space. He contemplated the nature of identity, realizing that he was simultaneously Anakin, Vader, Sith, Jedi, servant, master, observer, and participant, and that each layer contributed to insight, perception, and action. He also reflected on the galaxy itself, a living organism shaped by currents, choices, conflict, and belief. Every action, from a single sabotage to a planetary conquest, reverberated through time and perception, influencing outcomes far beyond immediate comprehension. He allowed himself to perceive this vast, intricate web of influence as a single living pattern, one that he could read, understand, and subtly shape through awareness, insight, and mastery of the Force. And in the quiet, in the solitude, in the hum of engines and the pulse of energy around him, Vader realized the final truth, that his legacy would endure, not only through power or conquest, but through understanding, perception, and influence woven into the currents of the galaxy itself. He let this awareness settle within him, deep and unshakable, like a current flowing through every atom of his being, a quiet acknowledgement that he was both a product and a shaper of history, a presence both temporal and eternal. And in this moment, he closed his eyes, breathing slowly, feeling the Force move around him, through him, and beyond him, as the galaxy turned, shifted, and carried all the echoes of past, present, and future.